Hello and welcome to the Switch4Good podcast. I'm Alexandra Paul and I'm here with my wonderful co-host, Dotsie Bausch. Hi, Dotsie.
Hey, y'all.
And we're also here in person with our guest, Nil Zacharias. Hi, Nil.
Hi, how are you?
Very well. Let me tell our audience a little bit about you before we get into our conversation, because we actually all had a really fun time this weekend partying like vegans do. So I want to talk about that before we get into really learning more about you, Nil. So our guest today is one of the most influential names within the plant-based movement. Nil Zacharias is a driving force behind curbing the impending climate crisis by promoting a plant-based lifestyle. He's the co-founder of the popular blog One Green Planet. He's the co-author of Eat for the Planet. He's a podcast host, and he's the founder of two plant-based platforms, Spire and 80/20 Plants. Amidst the alarming rate of rainforest destruction and the impending environmental crisis, Nil gives us hope that change is possible through plants. So let's jump right into it, because we got to talk about our partying, and then we've got a lot of stuff to talk about.
We did 80/20 partying on Saturday night, pretty much.
Yes. Hi, Nil. Thank you for being on our podcast.
Oh, thank you. And as I was saying earlier, I don't know what I'm doing here as a guest. I should be interviewing both of you because you both are such powerhouses.
On your podcast.
We can do that. So we'll continue. Well, this is a to be continued conversation. Yeah.
Exactly.
We will travel.
Well, we were all at the Mercy for Animals Gala, which is an annual fundraiser where Mercy for Animals, an amazing organization that was celebrating its 20th anniversary. Tell us what experience you had, because I was actually sitting next to Nil. It was just by chance. Did you know it was by chance that I was sitting next to you? Out of the 600 people that were there, we were at the same table.
Because we heard that you were going to be there. We're like, oh, we'll get to meet him in person. And then you're at his table, and then I don't know where I was because I didn't get to meet you at all. But they have been around for 20 years. It started with Nathan Runkle, who's now Milo Runkle. As a kid, right? He was 15, just kind of starting with open rescues in Ohio, of all places, to see where it's grown from those, humble beginnings to where they are now. I don't know. It's wildly inspiring for me, being only less than 1 year into our foundation, to see what's possible.
Well, also, Ari Solomon from Mercy for Animals also helped you become the activist that you are today. And
yeah, he sure did. They did. I got home from Olympic Games in 2012 and retired. I mean, basically I retired while standing on the podium. I knew it was the end. And I came back to Los Angeles, and I didn't really recognize when I was eating plant-based leading to the Olympics. I didn't know that there was a whole movement out there. It's like all these incredible people doing this work. I wasn't even on Instagram, barely on social media. I just didn't know that this this was the case. And it was one evening, my husband went up to Native Foods to get us some to-go food. He comes home, and evidently there was a small little MFA meeting at the Native Foods, and they had these flyers, and he comes home with a flyer, and he's like, there's these people that talk about what you talk about. And he hands me the flyer. And so I looked at it and called like that next Monday and got Ari. And he said, please come up, have lunch. We'll hang out and I'll tell you all about what we do. So that just catapulted me into activism. I mean, that was the reason. And I drove home on the 405 that day from the MFA office back down to Orange County. I left MFA. I bought like 10 T-shirts that were in my passenger seat. And I remember just being like, game on. Like this, I just was like filled with so much fire and excitement that this was, I knew that's what I wanted to pursue and spend the rest of my life doing. That's what I was here for.
Wow, that's a cool story. I mean, it's exciting to finally, I remember early days of when I started to eat plant-based, and I was starting to think that this is the, I've been mostly lied to about all the things I knew about food. And I think in some ways, my Googling and trying to search for the truth would eventually lead anyone to a video that MFA has something to do with. I think for me, the beginning was that they were the ones doing undercover investigations unlike anyone else. And while I no longer can stomach most of those videos, those were crucial things to take a look at to understand what really happens behind those, closed doors of factory farms. So every piece of information, every book I read, every video I watched played some role in my journey. So, it's funny that we ended up on the same table on Saturday, and I was my only regret that night is I didn't take a photo with Rob Zombie because I was really into his music growing up.
Yeah.
But that was such a fun night in general and such a celebration. It makes you just appreciate and sort of realize that you can start something that you care about, as insane and kind of left field as it may seem, and it can turn into this gigantic, powerful force. I mean, who would have thought a 15-year-old 20 years ago, 20-something years ago, right, when he started MFA, would have started this movement that's now inspiring you and everyone else out there to discover the truth behind what happens in the production of your food. So it's fun to always, I don't go out that often anymore, but it's always fun to play dress up and catch up with people who all share the same kind of values as you do. And it was a fun night for sure.
Yeah, it's power of perseverance.
So folks, well,
No, you're not getting out of it. You're trying. I know it's exactly what you're doing. You're going to go to. I want to hear.
Go to our guest.
Yeah. How?
Well, I want to say that I really appreciate Mercy for Animals because they really put a spotlight on farmed animals who have so few legal protections. And for a long time, the animal rights movement was focused on, and rightly so, because every animal needs to be saved. There's so many different, but animals in labs and animals spay and neuter. And then when the labs started to lock down because of the activists going into the labs, there was Nathan in a farm town in Ohio deciding to go into farms and start showing us the truth about what's going on in dairy farms and chicken farms. And he really expanded the movement. So I have a lot of appreciation for Mercy for Animals and a lot of appreciation for you, Nil.
Thank you.
You like that smooth transition. So let's talk about, you are now just you are an author about plant-based lifestyle, a blogger about plant-based lifestyle. You have several businesses around the plant-based lifestyle, but this was not always the case. Tell us what made you change from a lawyer to then and you were in marketing?
Advertising, digital, right?
Digital media, online advertising.
And now you are fully ensconced in the plant-based world.
It was almost 9 summers ago, that I kind of made a switch in the way, I would like to say the way I eat, but in some ways it was a switch in how I see the world and how I see my role in the world. So leading up to that point, for over a decade, I had spent the bulk of my career. I started off as an attorney, eventually just became an IP lawyer, did some work in the entertainment industry, but I also did a lot of work focused on technology and media. I realized that I didn't want to be a partner in a law firm. That just wasn't the future for me. So I kind of pivoted, ended up working in the digital media space, was lucky to work for companies that pioneered online advertising, where some of them were acquired by Google. I was a consultant for a few years. My last real job was at a startup that got acquired by Yahoo. I started to wonder if this was it. I mean, I was in my mid-30s. I was, I lived in Manhattan. I bought the dream apartment I wanted to buy. I felt like my life was, this is it. I made it. Except I kind of felt unfulfilled. So I would try to fill that hole by traveling a lot. And I think a lot of people tend to do that. It's like, let's explore the world. Maybe we'll learn something. And little did I know what I would learn. So I would spend every other vacation I would get, sometimes even just long weekends, and travel overseas. So I was hiking a lot. I was doing a lot of travel I went to the Middle East. I went to South America multiple times. And it was actually on one of the trips in South America, specifically Brazil and Argentina, where I was, told a lot about the great grass-fed beef that you get in Argentina. I had family who had traveled there and said, you must try the beef there. It's so different from the stuff you get in the U.S., which is all, not the same. It's not grown the same way. So I went and I ate beef 3 times a week. It seems like a weird way to start this conversation, but
it's the truth, though.
For that vacation, I was literally eating beef for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and loving it. And so during that same trip, I asked one of the tour guides, how is your beef industry so much better, and how does your beef taste so superior? And he said, well, it's grass-fed, and that helps. But it's not as it used to be. In fact, it's causing more problems than actually helping us. And I was like, what do you mean it's causing more problems? And what he went on to tell me about was something I didn't know anything about. He told me about the deforestation in the Amazon to clear land to plant soy crops to feed cattle. And firstly, so here's where I got confused, because I didn't know cattle ate soy. I thought humans ate soy.
Cattle aren't supposed to eat soy, but we humans make them eat soy.
Exactly. And also he said either they're clearing land to grow soy for cattle, or it's cattle grazing. And so this industry, as this grass-fed beef got more popular, more and more land was being cleared to make room for this industry.
To make room for soy-fed beef.
For soy, which was then exported to other countries. And also to clear land to graze cattle for grass-fed
on the
beef.
grass, right?
So either way, the system, it was the livestock system that was contributing to the destruction of the natural habitat of those regions. And so, and I'd love to say that was the moment, and everything changed.
It's not?
No, I mean, I came back, and I mostly had too much beef. So I was like, I'm going to stay off red beef for a while. But that conversation lingered on in my head, and it started a 6-month investigation into how my food was produced. And the more I learned about it, the less I wanted to eat the stuff I was eating previously. So,
Now, when you were learning about it, you were looking at it from an environmental point of view?
My first point of inquiry was the environment, because of that deforestation topic that we discussed. And so I started reading up about, so that was why, that was the trigger for me. But, in month 3, I was suddenly learning about, why these foods aren't even necessary from a health standpoint. And so it was the environment and the health argument that I started to really understand. I never went vegetarian. I was pescatarian for a while. And then 6 months later, I think I stumbled upon, in my searches, reading about the dairy industry. And I think I watched a couple of videos online. It could have been an MFA video for all you know. And then I read about what happens to dairy cows to produce milk. And it was a surreal moment. It was July 2010. And I'll never forget this moment, because I learned this one fact, that dairy cows have to be constantly impregnated for them to produce milk, which seems kind of obvious. Except I didn't even think of that until that very moment. And then, of course, I read what happens to the male calves, and they get sold for veal. And then that combined with the fact that I'd read all this research about how dairy is just unnecessary. It doesn't really, we're not meant to consume it. The ones that can tolerate lactose are those that we've genetically just sort of evolved to tolerate it.
Yep.
But most populations around the world can't. So you take that fact into consideration. You think about all the environmental facts that I was learning about, how not just the meat industry, but the dairy industry was also contributing to our environmental destruction globally. And then you add this third fact that what was happening to dairy cows was just something that seemed so barbaric that no horror movie could keep up, could kind of match with it. And, these cows are hooked up to machines for their whole life. So that moment was the moment. I said, well, I think I'm done. I mean, I'm done trying to figure out what is the right meat and fish and kind of cheese to consume. It's too complicated. I'm just going to opt out of this whole thing. And the next morning I woke up and it said, I guess I'm vegan now. I didn't even know what that was, but I was like, I guess I'm just not going to eat all this stuff, and we'll see where it goes. And so that was a moment. It kind of, as I said earlier, it did make a long version of it, but it changed my view of the world. And of course, it changed the way I was eating. And that's my story.
Yeah. We know
What a beautiful story. I love that you went from just savoring and loving eating this beef to that actual experience actually made you a vegan. So
it's so outwardly focused instead of inwardly selfishly focused. I mean, you enjoyed those 3 times a day down there. It tasted good to you, and that just wasn't even really a thought or a concern on your mind or on your tongue, on your lips when you said, I'm ready to opt out. It was like, I don't know if food's going to be flavorful again or not, but this is just not okay.
I think, everyone has their own journey. I mean, I think I still love the taste of meat. And I will say that here 9 years later,
like
too.
If you smell it, like if you go to a barbecue or something, you're kind of like, ooh, that makes you salivate.
Maybe not anymore in terms of that. I mean, I think now over the years I've kind of gotten over it, but I like meaty taste. Like that's why I'll enjoy plant-based burgers and sausages.
Yeah.
Because it wasn't the taste that I didn't like, and it wasn't necessarily because I was trying to be healthy or something at that point in time. I think everyone has to find their own way to this, and I just tend to be more analytical, and I tend to be like, I need facts and I need science. Someone trying to convince me over lunch or dinner would have never done it. I'd only met one vegan previously in my life, and she was yelling at me on the street to go vegan, and I was like, that's something I will never do. And I just sort of assumed, I jokingly say, I assumed that vegans just didn't like food. Because I equated all good food to be mostly meat, and but when I don't know, I feel like when a switch went off in my mind, it just kind of triggered a change that would then make it easy for me to discover new foods. And so, of course, not like I went vegan and I was eating lettuce the next morning. I was then on a new hunt to find what on earth can I eat. And I think I probably enjoyed more food after that point than I did before. Because when you eat, I think it's pretty cliched, but when you eat meat, you tend to go to your typical favorites, and you end up, you assume all flavor is the flavor that comes from meat. And then when you opt out of that, that's not an option, you just get more adventurous with your food. And I discovered, I didn't even really like hummus before that, as strange as that sounds. And I discovered this whole new world of food and cuisines and tastes, and realized, flavor doesn't really come from the meat itself most of the time. And so I never looked back. So that started what started as a diet change, then eventually became it became so important to me that I realized that I just, that coupled with I was kind of getting bored of my job, I really needed to do something in this space. And the big point I really started to focus on was, if I could change me, because I was a lover of those foods. If I could change, why aren't more people doing this? The facts exist out there. I discovered them. The truth exists out there. So there must be something wrong with how the facts were being presented. And that was partly true. I felt like it was either coming from environmental organizations or animal rights nonprofits, who all were doing great work, but the message somehow never resonated with me, and until I was maybe ready, I think. So then I kind of went on this mission to, let's find ways to present these facts about primarily the environment, but even beyond that, to people in a way that everyone could relate to. Let's make it cool. Let's make it fun. And that sort of set me down this new path where I've been focusing on the sort of plant-based food space, starting with media.
Yeah, so you started your the website, and then you started the podcast where you interview entrepreneurs who are dealing in the plant-based space.
Yeah, so I launched my first attempt to do something in this space was to launch a website called One Green Planet that still exists. I no longer run it. I've since moved on from that endeavor. That was this idea is like, how do we make it fun and exciting? There weren't any websites out there that were talking about food and the environment and health and animals in a way that was relatable, in a way that made it kind of interesting to people. And we did that, and it was super successful. We didn't anticipate that to happen. I mean, I gave up a pretty good job to focus on that, and wasn't quite sure if it was going to go anywhere. But, we went from the first year, it was 2013 that I quit my job to focus on it full time. we went from getting 300,000 unique users on the website to 3 million the next year, and 2 years later we were around 6 million, and we became the biggest website.
That's incredible to go from an IP attorney to a journalist.
Yeah,
basically.
and I always liked to write, so that was something
Okay.
that I was writing about something I cared about. So and we of course built a team. We had an office in Manhattan. It was great until I realized there was much more I wanted to do. And one of the campaigns we had launched while I was running One Green Planet was focused on the environment. I mean, because that still was the seed that led me down this path, was learning about deforestation. So this was like 2014 or something, and I looked around and people were talking about animal rights. People were talking about health and nutrition. There wasn't much going on about the biggest, in my opinion, the biggest problem, which is we're going to run out of land and fresh water, and we're going to destroy this planet we're living on, and we won't be able to survive in 20 to 30 years. Why isn't anyone talking about this? And part of the problem, again, was talking about the environment is kind of boring.
Well, even the environment,
Sexy enough,
but also
right?
the environmental organizations weren't linking
Totally.
the issue
Yeah, right.
to animal agriculture.
No, they
Any
didn't want to
kind
talk
of
about it. In
yeah.
fact, I tried to get them to write on my website, and they would say, well, I see you've got plant-based recipes on their website, and you're featuring videos from animal rights organizations. We don't want anything to do with that. And so, if you've seen the documentary Cowspiracy, I experienced that before the documentary Cowspiracy, where I was talking to people at environmental groups who didn't want to acknowledge that deforestation was happening because of animal agriculture, or that greenhouse gas emissions, which is contributing to climate change, had anything to do with animal agriculture. So we launched a campaign called Eat for the Planet, which was meant to be a fun social media campaign. It was hashtag Eat for the Planet, just to build some awareness around this issue using graphics and animations and trying to make it, again, digestible for everyday people who don't want to read boring scientific books about climate change. And that campaign eventually, turned into a book called Eat for the Planet. And Eat for the Planet lays out, I think, the environmental argument for why we need to shift our diets to being more plant-based. And then the podcast followed as me talking to people who are working on solutions to that problem, because I don't believe just putting the problem and the challenges out there is helpful if you don't also offer solutions. So, because otherwise people just end up descending into despair. Because they feel like they can't do anything. So the podcast is the solution-focused thing that I do, and then one thing led to another, and now I seem to be involved in 100 things.
So speaking of like facts and figures and science, which you said is really like that's where your compass lies, right? Like that's where one of the most kind of wow sort of facts and figures about the dairy industry in regards to the planet is that for every gallon of milk that we don't drink, we save the equivalent of 50 10-minute showers. That's a hell of a lot of embedded water in there. What were your top 1 to 3 facts, figures that just was like, okay, mind blown. This is something I have to spend my life focusing on?
Yeah, I mean, first and foremost, it was that to me, I don't even think, like, often people ask me, are you an environmentalist? And I say, I don't call myself an environmentalist or an activist or an evangelist or anything. Because what I try to communicate is common sense, right? So let's look at some common sense facts, because that's what I think really impacted me, which is, okay, we are currently dependent on a food system that is extracting natural resources much faster than those natural resources can replenish themselves. We're part of an entire economy that's doing that. But let's talk about the food system, because it's a big part of it. We have, developed this, only in the last 60 to 70 years, developed the industrial animal agriculture or factory farming system. And the reason I focus on that is because that's where we get 99% of our meat, dairy, and eggs. So we can talk about, better farms and smaller farms, but that's not where people are getting their food from, at least the majority of people. So let's focus on the real problem, which is factory farming. How did we get here? I actually don't think it's evil corporations. It may sound bizarre that I say that. I think it's, if you examine history, it's we people wanted meat. People wanted cheap meat and dairy. And so we found ways to create a food system to feed them that way. And it coincided with the industrialization of our entire economy. So we said, well, we'll do that to our farms. We'll turn them into factories. And, while forgetting what we're dealing with is living beings in the process. So the facts, right? We are 7.6 billion people on the planet today. We're going to be 10 billion by the year 2050. At any given point in time, there are 20 billion farm animals alive. Just that fact alone, the fact that there are 20 billion farm animals that are alive, either for the dairy industry or the egg industry or the meat industry, puts a heavy burden on our natural resources. So if we continue, meat eating is already pretty high in demand in the developed world and is increasing in popularity in the developing world. If we continue eating the way we eat today, and this isn't something I'm saying, this is where the science is and where the research points to, there's no way we'll be able to feed 10 billion people by 2050 without essentially destroying our life support systems, which is our oceans, our rainforests.
Because we'd have to have almost 40 billion animals then. I mean, it's
because we'll have to produce like 50% more meat
right.
if we continue with the current rate of demand that is also skyrocketing in countries like China and India. We're going to run out of land. We're going to run out of fresh water. We're going to have destroyed our rainforests. We're going to have, basically pillaged our oceans.
You're making it sound like this is in the future. We've actually done this.
We've already. This is already happening today. And even to sustain 7.6 billion people on a meat and dairy heavy diet is currently, that's why animal agriculture, also I'll sum it up in the most simplest ways. It occupies more than half of the land on the planet. It uses a majority of our freshwater resources. It releases more greenhouse gas emissions than the entire transportation sector combined. It's degrading our land. It's degrading our water. And it is also leading to species extinction. If you look at the heart of our environmental problem, it all points to this one system, which is how we produce food and which is the most dominant aspect of our food industry, which is industrial animal agriculture. And so that's why I say it's not necessarily just about the environment, because if you almost were to paint a picture and connect industrial animal agriculture to you can connect it to nearly every big problem on Earth, from hunger to injustice to even economic slavery in parts of the world, to destruction of the coral reefs, to, of course, the rainforests. And it just becomes abundantly clear we need a better way. And so, to me, it's just we can't, as far as I know, we can't create another planet. And
last time we checked.
Yeah.
And if we go to another planet, then we're just going to overpopulate that planet too, and we can't grow food there. It's maybe Elon Musk will get us to Mars, but that's all fine. But let's really be real. You don't have to be a tree hugger. You don't have to be an animal lover. You don't have to be a health nut to get this point, which is, if you truly want a future on planet Earth that feels like the planet we seem to have today, here's the deceptive part about the environment. You look outside the window, the sun's shining, and the trees are still, green, and there are birds chirping, and everything kind of seems fine. You look at the ocean; it seems so, it's not tangible. And how do you communicate? So to me, it all comes down to a communication problem, right? Which is, if it seems so abstract and it seems so disconnected from our everyday lives, people are less inclined to open their eyes to the reality facing them. So, I'll just kind of close out with this one last thing before we can go to talk about more other topics, which is that often when I came up with the book, I would go and give talks at some at festivals, at conferences, and especially I love it when I'm talking to people who I think are opposed to the idea, because otherwise, what's the point? Yeah. I mean, and I often lead with, this is not a left or a right issue. This isn't a liberal or a conservative issue. This isn't
tree hugger versus, hunter issue. It is like, do you want clean air and clean water? Most people will say yes. Do you want a future where your kids or your grandkids or your nephews or your nieces are going to grow up on a planet where they can get fresh, abundant food, and they can go swim in the ocean, and they can go enjoy a hike in a mountain or in a forest? Most people will say yes. And then when you ask, well, do you know that the food you're eating every day is actually putting that future at risk, where you're indirectly, but I think it's direct, actually. You're directly contributing to this destruction where you are now making it unlikely that future generations will enjoy the planet that we take for granted. Would you want to be part of that? Like, do you want to be, 20 years from now, do you want to have that conversation with someone who said, you knew that this was going on. The facts were clear. The science was clear. You knew, like we knew, that if we don't change the way we eat and we don't fix our food system, we're going to end up destroying humanity, really. The planet may survive, but most of us will perish. And you did nothing. You just sat back and continued business as usual. And I think that, to me, that one fact is what drives me every day, is that, well, every day is not perfect. And, even since I work in this space, it's not like, it's just rainbows and butterflies every day. It's hard work, but I'd rather be doing this than anything else, even on days when I don't see any tangible results, because I know what's the option? Do nothing? And
Absolutely.
so, that's really where I come from. This is that once you know the facts and once people are able to communicate it to you in a way that is, not pointing fingers, not judging people for where they were. Look at where I was. I keep thinking of my former self as in many ways when I communicate, I'm trying to talk to my former self who would typically not want to hear about stuff like this anymore, because it seems like it seems too idealistic. Versus I got to live my life and make money and get on with things. Life is hard enough anyway.
I want to ask you about the communication part, because I'm reading a book now called "Don't Even Think About It: Why Humans Are Unable to Grasp or Ignoring Climate Change." So climate change, and basically what the author George Marshall says, and the reason I started reading it was because I deal with the issues of animal rights and human overpopulation, which are two issues that people know facts about, but still don't seem to they resist making changes.
Right, actual actionable change.
And what George Marshall says is that actually facts do not change people's minds. Although when you're talking, I find you incredibly convincing. And I think we have to come at it at all different angles. And I wondered with the entrepreneurs with whom you speak, is what they're doing all making foods easier, making it, what is it that you have learned in terms of communicating? You seem to come from you were convinced by facts, but I'm sure you see that a lot of people are not, because a lot of people, my husband is a perfect example.
Yeah.
He knows the facts, but he still hasn't given up meat completely. He's cut it down hugely, but he still hasn't given it up completely. Maybe completely is maybe like your organization, your company, 80-20 plants. He's definitely 80-20. But I sometimes wonder how do I reach him? They're different folks.
And I also think, well, that depends on what change are you asking for again, right? So if you're, I don't think perfection is always the answer. And I'm not perfect, and I don't think most people are. I think it's acknowledging the truth and recognizing that, and giving people a path is what I try to do. So facts is just the starting point. And then it's, I recognize purely facts, and especially if you're pummeling people with facts and then saying, great, now wake up tomorrow and change everything you do, and you think about the world and think about food, and giving up things that you love when it comes to food is not easy. Let's be clear. It's so much part of our identity. It's part of our culture. It's part of our tradition. You're asking people to let go of things that they hold very dearly. So by no means am I saying it's easy and not everyone should hear me and then, switch and change the way they're eating. Because the first part is I give people a path, which is I choose to eat this way because for me, it makes the most sense. If you arrive at that same conclusion, that's amazing. I will high five you. But don't let the fact that you don't think you're ready to arrive at this place where I am in terms of the way I eat, stop you from taking the first step. So even in the book, I lay out, I don't say that people need to go plant-based. I say, here's what would happen if everyone ate this way. But yet I recognize it's not easy. So it's a 3-step process. Moderate your consumption of animal foods. Replace certain, everyday staples in your refrigerator and your pantry with plant-based options. I mean, that's really what my podcast focuses on, which is maybe you don't want to give up bacon. Fine. Does it mean that your mayo has to be have to contain eggs in it? Does it mean you can't try a plant-based butter or you can't eat sausages that are plant-based? So it's just that mind shift that, I have to change everything. Yeah. It's pretty scary for people. So
they don't do any. That's
yeah,
when
and then
say,
they don't end up doing
I'm not
anything.
going to do anything because that means I've failed.
Yeah, and it's like, oh my God, like, I'm not ready to do that. I'm not ready to give up. You know, how often I'm sure you've heard this, is that when you tell people the facts or you tell them about what happens to animals in factory farms or you tell them about why dairy is so unnecessary from a health standpoint, I'm sure you've heard this. People are like, but I don't think I can give up cheese, or I don't think I can give up fried chicken.
And then they're like, screw it.
And then it's like, wait, so don't give that up, right? How about, we have some... I think we also have to be empathetic from the place that we sit. Because if you sit in a position where you're like, but you need to give it up, you're being judged. You're kind of sitting on your high horse, like I'm better than you, and you're just not strong enough. That's how you can't give up.
Not enough willpower.
Yeah. So for me, it's like, no one said you should give that up. Well, let's examine everything else you eat, right? And let's start there. So before you know it, people realize, then that's great. I'm part of the solution now. I'm buying I buy almond milk. I'm already part of the solution. If you're going to give a common sense argument, you have to offer a common sense solution also. And the common sense solution to me is take that step in the right direction. And the facts are that most Americans are taking that step in the right direction. About 40% of Americans are trying to eat more plant-based. And like, I don't need to spew facts on this, but the fact that Beyond Meat's IPO was such a success, or that this whole plant-based industry is, every category of product in the plant-based industry is growing, tells you that doesn't mean everyone's going plant-based. It means people are shifting and people are incorporating more of those foods because they are getting the facts. So if your idea of success is why aren't more people giving it all up, then you're going to only see failure.
Right.
Versus if your idea of success is how many people are inching forward in the right direction, then I think we are succeeding. Could they go faster? Of course. I wish everyone went faster.
But they actually, if you had 1 million people give up 50% of their animal-based food, that might end up being more than if you had 1,000 people who gave it up completely. You might actually save more animals.
Right. True.
Right.
I mean, there's all kinds of facts to support, and that's why Meatless Monday has been so successful. It's like it just allows people an entry point, and that's where the second part of your question comes in about entrepreneurs, is that once they allow some of those foods into their diet, they realize those foods are pretty damn tasty. And they discover this whole new world of plant-based foods that are delicious, that are nutritious, that are better for the environment, better for your health, and obviously better for animals. And so, once you've opened that door, then the entrepreneurs come in, right? That's why that industry is growing so fast, is because, while many of them talk about the environmental impacts, very few of them talk about the impact on animals because they find that to be, I guess, scary point to
Severe,
market.
yeah.
It sounds like when you say something like an animal died for that's like being too harsh with people. Like, people are grown-ups. I think they should be able to deal with that.
Exactly.
But I think it's smart, because I think this is what the book that I'm reading by George Marshall says, is that people will lock into tribes, and if their tribe that doesn't like those animal rights people, then they won't buy stuff.
Oh, I 100% agree, and I face a lot of that. I mean, it's just by virtue of the fact that I eat vegan and that the work I do is largely in this space, I love talking to people who eat meat, and they look at me and they somehow assume that I will be this a flag waving vegan anarchist or something. And actually, frankly, I frankly don't care what you eat. I'm just telling you what I know, and if it helps you, that's great, and if not, then it's up to you. I think people need to make decisions for themselves. And I think when it comes to the world of plant-based food and entrepreneurship, I think there you have to, of course, the food has to taste great. It has to be priced right, and it has to be made available. There are a lot of challenges in getting to those points. And then, of course, is how you communicate it. And again, I'm seeing that's an evolving process. I think when it comes to, say, the millennial generation or Gen Z, they don't mind hearing the truth. They don't mind hearing the facts. In fact, they've grown up with the truth. Yeah. They grew up, they're digital natives. I mean, I think Gen Z, which is about 25% of the population, which is the generation after millennials, so they're...
When were they born?
1994 to 2007. They are going to, make up about 40% of consumers by 2020. Will have the most buying power in a few years. Digital natives, the most diverse generation, the most technologically advanced generation, they didn't grow up watching dairy commercials on TV.
They watched MFA videos on.
They watched YouTube. Yeah. They consume their content through YouTube, Instagram, social media, their friends, and who text them stuff. And for them, the truth is a search away on the internet. And so they didn't grow up in a world where, like say me, grew up watching commercials where, dairy is what makes you strong. Or if you're going to give you strong bones, meat will give you protein. You have all these, marketing messages which have become cultural myths in many ways. They don't have that baggage. And so they also don't have the baggage that a lot of older folks like me do, which is that you have met vegans who can be pretty annoying, and you think of vegans as being kind of this crazy animal rights anarchists who are going to yell at your face and throw blood at you. Kids don't know that. They think
I love those people. Those are my people. don't be insulting my people, but okay.
No, listen, you need all of it.
It's you,
right?
That's right.
And when it comes to marketing, you need, you don't know what message is going to resonate
PETA's had
with
a
everyone.
has really helped mainstream veganism because it's made HSUS and Mercy for Animals and Switch4Good seem really middle of the road. That's why I love PETA so much.
And there's no right and wrong.
Right?
Yeah.
Let me be
you have
clear.
to have something to compare to. And
Yeah.
it's like,
They're not PETA.
There's no. I don't believe there's any right or wrong approach because you never know what works for people. Right. I've met many people who've started learning about their food because they were handed a flyer at a concert, at a punk rock show by PETA. Or I know people who, done it because of the health reasons. I know people who've seen people protesting on the streets or watched a horrific documentary. All I try to do is what feels right for me.
Yeah.
And I'm assuming it resonates with some kind of people. And I think everyone needs to do what's authentic to them because we're, as I said, 7.6 billion people on the planet. We all don't think the same ways. We all are not driven by the same things. And you never know what works for folks. But the bottom line is that the truth is the truth.
Yeah. Let me ask you a quick question that I get asked and I don't really know the answer to. So we're saying eat plants, not animals. And we know that if we took out the animals, we're taking out, quote, the middleman, right? And we say, that humans should just go straight to the source and eat the grains and the plants. But we also know that plants are obviously inherently less calorie dense than a piece of meat. Do we have enough room on the planet to grow enough plants? And how? I mean, how much room do we have? How much do we know the stats on how much? everybody went vegan tomorrow,
meat.
Yeah.
If we
to feed enough to get enough calories to each person on the planet, all 7.7 billion of us.
Yeah, I think if you look at the amount of land that's used today to either grow crops to feed animals or to just graze animals or keep them in farms for a few years while they're alive. If we suddenly didn't need all those 20 billion land animals that are alive. And again, land animals, because we're not talking about the ocean yet. You will free up that land, theoretically. Like, so if you look at
I guess if we're feeding
facts,
20 billion animals, but they're only alive for a short period of time. And
true. And so the facts are that we'll be able to redirect enough of those of those calories to feed 4 billion more people. More
Okay.
people. So not just the 7.6 or 7 that we are right now. We can technically feed 10 billion people or beyond that, 11 billion people. Because we would suddenly have more land to grow more crops that would be directly fed to human beings. Because today, when what we're essentially doing is, the animal is the middle man in the process. We're taking 100 calories of grain, and we're running it through this inefficient system. And I mean, it's terrible to call it a system, but that's what it is. And we're converting it into meat, dairy, and eggs. And what we end up what ends up happening in the process is a tremendous loss of calories. So the conversion ratio of 100 calories of grain only gives you 3 calories of beef. So you're losing 97 calories in the process because those calories could go to feed humans. Now, not necessarily those specific crops, but of course, if you could use up that land, you could reforest certain areas, and we could grow enough food to feed everyone. So, is that going to be a silver bullet solution? Of course, we have to then figure out just and equitable ways to farm even vegetables to be able to feed the world, because a lot of our problem with feeding the world is also a distribution problem, right? There is enough food in America. A lot of it gets wasted. So I'm not saying that just taking out animals fixes everything, but it's without that, we don't really have a shot, in my opinion.
Well,
Thank you.
distribution has always been a problem. So for me, it seems like it's a built-in problem. So for people to say, well, if we just solve the distribution problem, then we don't have to worry about feeding the world. We have to take into account there will always be some distribution inefficiency. It's just the nature of food.
And I think that's why, my energy started to shift more towards what's happening in the food industry, because besides just, spewing facts and realizing not everyone's going to change, is like, what can I do, or what can people do to actually be a part of the solution, besides changing what's on your plate? And if that's all you do, that's more than enough. By no means am I saying everyone needs to get involved in the food industry, but I personally felt I could do more being involved, or at least providing a platform to entrepreneurs, to investors, to companies, to explore ideas, to learn from each other, so that we can create a better food system.
And what have you learned?
I mean, I've learned that that we are heading in the right direction, but we have a long way to go. And I think that it starts with firstly shifting away from our dependence on industrial meat. Like we consume way too much of it. We produce way too much of it. Meat, dairy, and eggs.
And it's shelf life, by the way, because I pick up food from 3 health food stores every week to then make a meal for the homeless. And we don't pick up the dairy because we're with Food Not Bombs, which feeds vegan meals. We don't pick up the dairy, eggs, or meat, but they have so much because there is such a much shorter shelf life. It's just more dicey. You can't because you could get very, very sick off those if they stay too long.
Yeah, I mean, and also the price of meat, dairy, and eggs stays low artificially because of subsidies, and we won't get. That's a whole nother topic we can get into if you want to.
That's an important topic.
It is
that keeps people. There's no big broccoli, as Dr. Michael Greger says, keeps people to
fat, sick, and nearly dead.
Yeah,
That's what it keeps them.
And so the price of not only the inherent price, but the price on the planet is never taken into account when we buy this cheap milk, meat, which we expect. And we expect it to be humane, and that's the big lie.
It's the story of subsidies is kind of a sad one. It is an economic decision that was made at a point in time in the early 1900s, after World War I, actually, because during World War I we had to produce more food. So at that point in time, around 1914 to 1918, I think that's when World War I happened. We increased production of food to feed the troops and to feed parts of Europe that needed access to food during the war. But at the end of the war, what ended up happening is the food prices went low because there was a surplus of food in the U.S. The farmers started to default on their loans because they were encouraged to produce more food, so they took out loans and they bought these farms, and they started to go bankrupt, which then threatened the viability of the banks. So this is a classic American capitalism story, which is so the government said, well, if prices of if farmers are not going to be able to produce food at a because it's so cheap and there's not enough demand for it, we've got to keep the price of food artificially low. So
the farmers in business.
And the farmers in business. So give them a living wage, which is theoretical. The farmers did get the raw end of the deal in the long run. But essentially what we did, the economists, the politicians, agricultural experts got together and said, let's pull out our farming system, most specifically our industrial meat, dairy, and egg farming system out of the free market economy, and let's pump it up with subsidies to keep the prices artificially low. And that set in motion, we've now... So, and also what happens when you keep the price of meat, dairy, and eggs and food in general low, people have more money to buy other things. It keeps the economy flourishing. So it made sense. That's why I say it's not necessarily always evil people who've gotten us to this point. Right. But yeah, there are corporations that then exploited those conditions and created these mega meat companies. And here we are now in 2019, and now we've realized that those decisions that we made for what seemed like the right reasons to protect the economy, to help the American people, to give them what they wanted, which is cheap food, we've now learned, well, most of that food is cheap, but the cost on our health, as you said, the cost on the environment and the cost on animals is just not factored into
just haven't
it.
Evolved.
So all you can do, I think, right? I mean, I say back to the issue of, what can we do and how can this industry really change and how can we define a new food system? Start simple, help the plant-based food industry. I mean, I think we have all the stats are pointing to the right direction. This, plant-based food sales are outpacing traditional grocery sales. They've grown 31% in the last 2 years. Every category, if you look at plant-based meats, they've gone up 10% in the last year. Plant-based milks are now 13% of all liquid milk sales. Plant-based yogurts have gone up nearly 40%. And keep in mind, while dairy yogurt is declining, while dairy milk sales are declining, plant-based is rising. And cheese is flatlined. Dairy cheese is flatlined, while plant-based cheeses are on the rise. So every category in the industry is starting to grow, which is why we've seen about like $17 billion invested in plant-based and cell-based meat and dairy companies in the last 10 years. And, in 2018, I think about 1/3 of all food investments went to plant-based. So here's the good news. I mean, I think we've been talking a lot of, about the problems, but the good news is that we're finally seeing some momentum in the right direction, is that we've got this new industry. We've got, not only the fact that sales are increasing, consumers want more of it. And as I said earlier, Gen Z and millennials are trying to eat more plant-based. But even the meat industry acknowledges that this is the future. At least they're investing in companies. They're launching products in the space. They are acquiring companies. So I think we're at an interesting point, a turning point. And I think now's the time for us to kind of double down on our efforts to get people to understand that, and this is what I understood 9 years ago when I first changed the way I ate. I said to myself, well, I don't know much about economics, but the one thing I do know is that if you increase demand, people will supply that. So if you get people to want these foods, then companies will show up and make them. And look at what's happened. I mean, I have not done it single-handedly,
but you've been part of it. But are there thoughts about the transition for people who were in the old way? So for those farmers to transition, so that the argument that, well, what about the farmers?
Yeah.
We don't seem like we're farmer haters, which we're not. What's the solution for them?
I think there has to be a more in-depth discussion and conversation around that. I think so far, the plant-based food industry has been more focused on, we're already at such a disadvantage compared to what we're up against. It's more expensive to produce these foods. They're also these companies are all startups, and they're just trying to get by and raise money and then figure out how to manufacture these unique products that they're making. And then once they manufacture, then find distribution. Some companies with the resources have been looking into where they source their ingredients and finding ways to see how we can help farmers transition out. I think there's some very early efforts that aren't public yet to do that.
Trying to do that.
Yeah, so like some dairy
and
farmers.
A2PX, we've talked about them on this show too. Helping dairy farmers, specifically some Amish dairy farmers in northeastern Pennsylvania, change their dairy farms over to yellow pea farms, right, which is the most versatile of all the pulse crops. But inherently, it's very challenging because of the soil. Some soil is primed and ready that has been a dairy farm for many years and can change over within a year, and some it's up to 7 years and that's obviously you can't just go without.
We
for
could
7
put the
years.
subsidies there. That's the idea.
Yeah.
And some farms, I think chicken farms can transition into hemp farming. Some dairy farmers have transitioned into almond, and a lot of it in California actually has happened because of the rise of and the popularity of almond milk specifically. But so there's a lot that needs to be done, and I think we can't solve it all at once. We've got to start somewhere and at least get people to recognize that. Just imagine if everyone acknowledged this is the direction we needed to head in. We have to create a mostly plant-based food system. We got to get people to eat largely plant-based foods. Then we could start, making sure that we could have cross-organization, cross-government, global coordination to help such an effort. And I think there are some organizations and groups in the nonprofit world that are starting to do that, and I think you're going to see a lot of interesting developments in the next 5 to 10 years.
Tell us the mission of 80/20 before we go, because I want people to hear that so that they're drawn to.
Yeah,
check it
80/20
out.
plants it answers a simple question. We've all met people who we know who are like, well, I heard all those facts. Now what do I do? And then you try to help them eat plant-based, and you give them 100 recipes and show them resources. What if there was a simpler way? What if you could just point them to one resource that they could sign up for that would guide them through the entire process of shifting their diets away from how it is currently, which I'm assuming is meat, dairy, and eggs largely, to one that is at least 80% plants. So 80/20, what 80/20 stands for is 80% whole food plant-based, because I've learned myself too in 9 years of eating this way is that I try to eat at least 80% whole food plant-based because that's the best option for my health. 20% you leave room for all your favorite indulgent plant-based options, whether it's the meats and the cheeses and the burgers and the sausages. And the program also allows some flexibility where you get about 2 meals a week where you can if you want to eat that bacon so badly or some cheese, you can do that. So it's an online program you can sign up for, and it'll guide you through the process. And there's a health coach you can reach out to 24/7. I really got involved in that project because I felt like people needed a simple way and a more interactive and fun way to transition and change and see that this way of eating can be fun and exciting as well.
Awesome.
That's good. And Spire also is a new project that you have that tell us about that.
Yeah, Spire is super new. It is an extension of what I've been doing on my podcast, which is talking to entrepreneurs and investors and trying to help promote the plant-based foods industry. I also have a conference, which is part of Plant-Based World Expo, which happens in New York every June. It's called the Eat for the Future conference. But I felt like we were talking earlier, how do you encourage companies in this space to all compete and grow when we're up against this giant food system that is kept artificially cheap because of subsidies? We've got to help these companies and give them resources. So Spire is going to be an event series that connects entrepreneurs, investors, service providers, wannabe entrepreneurs, or people who want to get jobs in this growing plant-based foods industry to connect with each other, learn through small networking events that will start in LA. And the idea then is to expand nationally and who knows what beyond that.
Well, thank you for everything that you're doing in the plant-based world.
We're expecting lots more out of you.
Yes,
Anything we look at your history, we know that the future is bright.
Well, thank you so much for having me on. I mean, I'm just, I couldn't believe I was coming here today to be asked questions by both of you because like I feel I'm usually the one doing the questioning.
We understand.
So this is a little bizarre, but firstly, more importantly, because you both are doing such amazing work with Switch4Good and this podcast specifically, and I'm really excited to join forces and do more stuff together.
Let's do it. Thank you.
Thank you. So thank you so much for tuning in today. If we helped you in any way, then click the subscribe button and let's keep hanging out together. We have so much more to share with you.
And if you need more information on actually making the Switch for Good, please visit us at switch4good.org for loads of info. And you can subscribe to our mailing list where you will receive all sorts of super cool gifts, discount codes to our very fave dairy-free products, and a lifetime of powerful health tips.
So join us on the journey to Switch for Good. This is the future.